last two verses of Hebrews chapter 6, because as we know, the original parchments and documents did not have chapter and verse divisions. So you've got to read all of Hebrews all the way through as if there are no chapter divisions, and the argument builds on itself. So when we look at Hebrews chapter 7, we've got to look at the last couple of verses in chapter 6. So I'll read those to you just to remind you of them. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. Just in passing, he uses quite a few nautical metaphors. So again, the idea of the anchor of the soul, a wonderful phrase. And this that's the anchor of the soul, he goes on to explain, a hope that enters into the inner shrine behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf. So we know the curtain was the curtain that separated the inner sanctuary in the temple from the outer courts. Jesus has gone all the way into the Holy of Holies. And of course, it was only the high priest who was allowed to do that. So we're looking at Jesus as the eternal high priest in this passage. And Melchizedek has already been mentioned in chapter 5, but here he is again, because what the writer to the Hebrews is going to argue is that Melchizedek established an order or a system of priesthood which preceded the Levitical priesthood, but is also superior to it. So the end of Hebrews 6:20 says this, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek, I'm not sure what or how much was said about Melchizedek last week, but he's one of the most intriguing characters in the Bible. His name, and there are several versions of his name, but his name means King of Righteousness, which is a very telling title. I think if you are called King of Righteousness, the title signifies much more than just a name like Jim or Janet or Brian or Eva or whatever. It signifies his status and his character. So he's King of Righteousness. Now, he's only mentioned twice in the Old Testament. And the first one in Genesis 14:18-20 is actually the passage that the writer to the Hebrews takes as his inspiration and foundation for Hebrews chapter 7. So let me read Genesis 14:18-20 to you. You might well have a Bible in front of you there. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now, just to pause there for a moment. Salem was the original name for Jerusalem and comes from a word that means peace. And what has just happened is that Abraham has won a great victory over various kings, an assemblage of kings. And he meets Melchizedek, who brings out bread and wine. And of course, we associate bread and wine with communion, with the kingdom and the coming king. And it goes on to say in Genesis 14, verse 18, he, that's Melchizedek, was priest of God Most High. Now, the title given to God there associates him with Jehovah, the one true God. So he's brought out bread and wine. He's a priest and he's a king, which is a unique combination. And then it goes on to say, and he, that's Melchizedek, blessed him, that is Abraham, and said, blessed be Abram, that was Abraham's name before the covenant that was about to be made with God. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. Now, this description of God as Most High and as Creator, again, identifies him with the one true God. Over and over again, for example, in Revelation, God as Creator is emphasized. He has made heaven and earth. Now, another aspect of what I've just read to you, blessed be Abram by God Most High, is that what the writer to the Hebrews is going to emphasize is that the superior person blesses the inferior person. And yet Abram was the father of the Jewish nation, the inheritor of the covenant with God that preceded the covenant of the law. And it was a covenant based on faith and grace. And that's why Paul uses Abraham as a great example of righteousness by faith in the book of Romans. Okay, to go back to Genesis chapter 14, blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. We call that a tithe. So a tenth of the spoils of the great victory that Abraham has just won are given to Melchizedek on behalf of God. And of course, those who teach correctly on tithing point out that tithing precedes the law. It's not an aspect of the law. Here it is in Genesis 14, predating the law. The other reference to Melchizedek in the Old Testament is in Psalm 110 and verse 4. Now, the psalm famously begins with, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool." And then he goes on in verse 4 to say, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." Now, that order of Melchizedek is directly quoted, that phrase is directly quoted in Hebrews 6, verse 20. And an order of priesthood is a system of priesthood, and strongly associated with that system of priesthood is the law. So, for example, Aaron established the Levitical priesthood, and the Levitical priesthood were, if you like, the overseers of the law of Moses. So the system of priesthood is strongly associated with the way in which God relates to man. And that's going to be an important point that is brought out in Hebrews 7. Okay, so some intriguing comments about Melchizedek. He's king of Salem, he's king of righteousness, he brings out bread and wine to have communion with Abraham, he blesses him as the spiritual superior, and in return, Abraham gives him a tenth or a tithe of what he has won in battle. And then in Psalm 110, verse 4, we're reminded that there is an order of priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. Right, as we move on then to Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 to 4 speak about the significance of Melchizedek, and Abraham is mentioned several times in these verses because, of course, the Jewish people revered Abraham and do revere Abraham as the father of the Jewish nation, their patriarch, their ultimate patriarch. So because Abraham received a blessing from Melchizedek and tithed to him, that argument is going to be used by this author to establish the superiority of Christ over the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the new covenant over the old covenant. Now, starting then in verse 1, this Melchizedek, and has been mentioned several times in the previous two chapters. So we're continuing an argument. Everything in Hebrews leads on to the next thing and the next thing, and then it relates back to something earlier. It is beautifully constructed. Whoever wrote this was really inspired, and it has the brilliance of argument of Paul, although I don't think probably it was Paul. I think it may well have been Apollos or someone like that. Anyway, verse 1, as Melchizedek's been mentioned several times, he's a unique combination of king of Salem. We eventually end up calling Salem Jerusalem, and the Jebusites originally owned it until David purchased Mount Zion from the Jebusites, and then the city of Zion and the city of Jerusalem was established. That's a side issue in a sense, but it's really worth investigating. It's a fascinating story. So Melchizedek was a combination of king and priest. Now, that was a combination that was not normal in Jewish society. The two were seen as separate, but of course, Jesus is both high priest and king of kings. So this combination in Melchizedek of king and high priest is very important as an example or a type of Jesus. So he's priest of the Most High God, and as we said earlier in verse 1, he blessed Abraham. And then in verse 2, as we've said, Abraham tithed to Melchizedek as to a spiritual superior. We've also said that his name means King of Righteousness and King of Salem. And it's worth remembering that Jesus is Prince of Peace. Whenever I'm faced with a difficult situation, a complicated, difficult situation, and it seems to occur fairly often, the Lord keeps reminding me of that lovely beatitude, blessed is the peacemaker. It's as if he's saying to me constantly, Brian, try to be a peacemaker. Try to find some common ground. Try to find some way of reconciliation. And I like to be blessed, so I'm going to be a peacemaker. Blessed is the peacemaker. Amen. Now, some Christians need to learn that beatitude because we don't always spread peace around. But let's be at peace, and let's exude peace, and let's minister in peace. Now then we come to a really intriguing statement in verse 3, that Melchizedek had no father or mother or genealogy. In other words, you couldn't trace him back to one of the patriarchs. You couldn't track him down back to previous kings of Salem or anything like that. He just seems to have appeared out of nowhere. But actually, the point that is being made is that he stands alone. He's unique. He's not descended like the Levitical priesthood from father, grandfather, great-grandfather, etc. He stands alone. And then, of course, Christ, whom he resembles, to use the word in verse 3, he also stands alone and is unique. Jesus did not have predecessors after the order of Melchizedek or the order of priesthood. Okay, so this is an intriguing verse, verse 3. He had no father or mother. That's Melchizedek or genealogy, and then quote, and has neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Now that really is intriguing. It has led some to consider that Melchizedek was actually what's called a theophany, an appearance or manifestation of Christ. However, there are words and phrases in the text which point rather to the fact that he is a type, a unique type with whom Christ can be identified. And one of those words or phrases is in verse 3. He resembled the Son of God. He wasn't the Son of God. He resembled the Son of God. An important distinction. In the Greek language, it's just made like. He was made like the Son of God in terms of his superiority and the uniqueness of his priesthood, which Jesus is going to build on. And at the very least, we can say that Melchizedek was a type of Christ and a type of his priesthood. And then we have an exclamation in verse 4. See how great he is. It's as if the writer is saying, look, having said all this, you've got to be convinced about the greatness of Melchizedek. And thinking about the Genesis 14 passage, the idea that Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish people, considered Melchizedek to be his spiritual superior is motivating the writer to the Hebrews to compare him with Christ, or Christ with him. And the tithe given by Abraham is going to form part of the extended argument as we go into verses 5 to 10. Now, it's a fairly involved argument, so I'll try to make it as clear as I can. But essentially, what the writer to the Hebrews is doing is taking this concept of tithing, that you tithe to a priest. And he's going to contrast the tithing that Abraham made to Melchizedek, and therefore the tithe that we make on a Sunday morning or whenever to Jesus as our high priest, with the tithe that was given to the Levitical priests. That was the Jewish priests from the tribe of Levi. So in verse 5, he begins this argument in this way, that the sons of Levi who receive the priestly office gave a command to the descendants of Abraham to tithe to them. Now, let me repeat that maybe a little more simply. In other words, those who were considered to be the priests of the Jewish people, the Levites, required the Jewish people, in other words, the descendants of Abraham, required them to tithe to the Levitical priests. That's the beginning of his argument in verse 5. And then in verse 6, it begins with the word but. Now, notice the next two words. I'm quoting from the RSV. But this man, that's Melchizedek. So he's not seen here as a theophany, a manifestation of God. He's not seen as that. He's seen as a man, but quite a unique man, and certainly at least a type of Jesus. But this man who has not their genealogy, in other words, Melchizedek was not a Levite. He did not belong to the tribe who gave the Jewish people all their priests exclusively. So this man was not their genealogy, but he received tithes from Abraham and blessed him, that's Abraham, who had the promises, that is the covenant from God. Now that's an involved but very intense argument that Melchizedek did not belong to the Levite tribe. He was not a priest after the order established through Moses and Aaron. However, he received tithes from Abraham and blessed him, despite the fact that Abraham was the father of the Jewish people and had received the promises of God. And then in verse 7, something I've already said, the inferior is blessed by the superior. In other words, Melchizedek superior to Abraham. By implication, then, Jesus is superior to Abraham. And already in the argument earlier in Hebrews, it has been established that Jesus is superior to Moses. Those are the two great figures, along with David, I suppose, in Judaism. They revere Moses as the giver of the law, and they revere Abraham as their father, their common father. But Melchizedek is superior to Abraham. You can see the argument unfolding. It's beautifully done. Verse 8, here, in other words, in the Jewish world of his day, whenever this letter was written, in the Jewish world of his day, tithes are received by mortal men. In other words, the sons of Levi, those who were called to the priesthood, they're mortal men, and they receive tithes from Jewish people. There, that's in the day of Melchizedek, there by one of whom it is testified that he lives. In other words, he continues to live. So the mortality of the Levitical priests, in other words, they were men who would live and die, is contrasted with the eternity by implication of Jesus. And Melchizedek is a type of that timelessness and eternity and immortality. And then in verses 9 to 10, just to finish this little section off, now it's quite an involved argument, so let me go through this quite slowly. So Levi himself, that's the Levitical priests, the Jewish priests of the day. They would have served in the temple until the temple was destroyed in AD 70. They received tithes from the Jewish people. So Levi himself, who received tithes, paid tithes to Melchizedek. Why? Through Abraham, because Abraham was the father of the Levites. And if we follow the argument, the Levites receive tithes, but because they were, use the phrase in Hebrews, they were still in the loins of Abraham, still to be born as Abraham's children. In that sense, because Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek, the unborn Levites gave tithes to Melchizedek through Abraham. Now, it's an involved argument, beautifully done. I think Orthodox Jews would be a bit skeptical of it, but there it is, verses 9 to 10. Now we come to the final little section that we're going to look at tonight, which is Hebrews 7, 11 to 14. The argument that is being built up really beautifully is that the Levitical priesthood is inferior to the type established by Melchizedek, and therefore, by implication, Jesus, the high priest, is superior to the Levitical priesthood. the powerful connection that is going to be made, and this would have really challenged the Hebrew listeners or readers of this letter, is that if you say that a system of priesthood has been superseded or improved on or replaced by a better system, then the law that goes along with the old system has also been replaced. Now, that's an important argument, but a challenging one for those who were Jews and are now Christians. So let's begin this little section in verse 11. If the Levitical priesthood, after the order of Aaron, had been the perfect expression of the priesthood, these are my words, the law having been given in conjunction with this priesthood. So what he's arguing is that if the Levitical priesthood had been the perfect priestly system or order, it would not have been replaced by the priesthood of Jesus Christ. And along with that imperfect system of Levitical priests was also the law of Moses, and therefore, by implication, it has also been replaced. So he's basically saying it then in verse 11, why is there a need? If the Levitical priesthood was perfect, why is there a need for, quote, another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek? Now, he's arguing beautifully, powerfully, but it has to be said his argument is based on a very few verses in the Old Testament on an intriguing character called Melchizedek. However, I said in our introduction to Hebrews that what we're going to see all the way through Hebrews is that everything in the Old Testament is a type or a foreshadowing of Jesus. And that when we read the Old Testament, we need to constantly ask ourselves, what does that tell us about Jesus? And I think I talked a little bit about Paul's example of that to the Corinthians, where he spoke about the rock. Do you remember the rock that was spoken to and struck, and or should have been struck and then spoken to? And then it says the rock was Jesus. So that's a very good example of a type in the Old Testament. That there's this amazing rock that keeps following the children of Israel around. And Paul gives us the interpretation in Corinthians, the rock was Jesus. A really good example of what I'm talking about, that when we read the Old Testament, we keep asking, what does that tell us about Jesus? Jesus is the whole message from Genesis to Revelation, the entire message. He is the truth. Okay, back then to Hebrews 7 and verse 12. And I'm quoting from the RSV. For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. That's very convincingly argued, because the role of the priesthood was to oversee the law, and especially with regards to the temple, the sacrifices, and so on. And so what the writer to the Hebrews is saying, well, look, because the Levitical order of priesthood has been replaced, that necessarily, he uses the word necessarily, that necessarily means there's a change in the law as well. Now, one of the things that challenges me and puzzles me somewhat is that Jeremiah 31 is very clear. Jeremiah prophesies that the old covenant will be replaced by a new covenant. And yet we have a whole nation still fixated on the old covenant. And what we need to pray for our lovely Jewish brothers and sisters, well, they're not brothers and sisters yet, but they will be. We need to pray that they read Jeremiah 31 and that their eyes are open. Right, the old covenant is being superseded by the new covenant. And of course, that is what the writer to the Hebrews is going to get to in later chapters. Right, and verse 13, for the one of whom these things are spoken, that's Jesus, belonged to another tribe, from whom no one has ever served at the altar. So Jesus is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek. He was not descended in his incarnation from the tribe of Levi, but from Judah. And therefore, we've got to say that, as this author says, Moses says that in verse 14 we're in, Moses said that in connection with that tribe, Moses has nothing to say about priests. In other words, the whole Mosaic order of priesthood based on the sons of Levi has been replaced by the incarnate Jesus Christ, the high priest, descended in the natural, as it were, from Judah, not from Levi. So the whole argument has been consistent from the end of chapter 6 right through to verse 14, and will continue in the rest of this chapter. And to put it really simply, what is being argued here is that there are two orders of priesthood. There's the order of priesthood of which Melchizedek is the type, and which is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Then we have the order of priesthood, which was established through the law of Moses, which is that the sons of Levi would become priests. And he uses various arguments to show that the priesthood of the order of Melchizedek is superior to the priesthood of the sons of Levi. Now, for a group of people, may have been an entire church or the section of a church, who were being written to in this letter to the Hebrews, you can see what the writer's doing. Not only is he establishing the supremacy of Jesus Christ, but he's also, one after another, taking the things that Judaism held as most sacred and showing these people who are threatening to go back into Judaism, showing them that each one of them has been superseded in and through and by Jesus. It is beautifully argued. I think the elegance of the argument, the intricacy of it, it's challenging stuff, which is why I think you don't hear too many sermons on the book of Hebrews. I don't know, but I think it's a wonderful book and so beautifully written.